Welcome to the Regeneration Collective podcast, The Next UN, Visions for a Regenerative Future. I'm Silke from Brockhausen, a UN insider with 18 years across more than a dozen UN missions and founder of the Regeneration Collective. As the UN approaches its 80th year and the campaign for the next Secretary General gets underway amid protracted conflicts, widening inequalities, and cross-planetary boundaries, we ask, how can the UN become the platform through which people, institutions, and the more than human world repair and transform broken systems and create conditions where life can thrive? In each episode, we speak with regenerative practitioners, policy shapers, indigenous knowledge holders, peace builders, culture makers, and frontline humanitarians about the lived experiences and visions that could translate into regenerative UN policies, organizational culture, and operations. This is for UN staff, partners, member states, and bridge builders who are curious about what regeneration means in practice and who are ready to turn the UN into a trailblazer for this shift. Today, I'm joined by Eric Martin, a leadership expert, speaker, and author whose work has touched leaders from the White House to the UN. Eric is the founder of Adaptive Change Advisors, the mission-driven organization bringing adaptive leadership tools developed over 4 decades at Harvard Kennedy School into practice around the world. He has worked with the United Nations Innovation Network and the UN Environment Program, supporting staff in navigating complexity and change. He's also the author of Your Leadership Moment and the Adaptive Leadership Facilitator Guide, which help people democratize leadership and turn challenges into opportunities for transformation. Eric's conviction that leadership begins with personal transformation and that this inner work is the foundation for systemic change deeply resonates with regenerative practice. I'm delighted to have him with us today to explore what adaptive and regenerative leadership can mean for the UN and the world. Hi, Eric.
Hey, Silke.
Good to see you and have you here, especially a day after International Day of Peace, where we are recording this, and a day where the UN General Assembly's high-level segment is starting. I think it's an opportune moment to discuss what kind of future we want with the UN. And the theme of our podcast is regeneration. So, in your words, what does regeneration mean to you simply and practically as someone who's working also with the UN?
Well, first of all, it's great to be here, Silke. I love what you're doing and how you're integrating all these different domains of exploration in this bucket of regeneration. Um, I think regeneration for me, obviously it's about bringing back to life what has been lost, soil, biodiversity. I think beyond that, it's about uh, it's about a fundamental redefinition or a change in how we relate. So you think about the relationship between a farmer and their soil, right? That's a very concrete example. But I think it goes beyond soil. It goes to how we think about wealth. It goes to how we think about value or success or power. I'll give you just an example. You may know Robin Wall Kimmerer. She spoke last year's
Braiding
UN Day.
sweetgrass.
Braiding Sweetgrass, one of my favorite books. And I was so glad to see her get the visibility that she got at the last General Assembly. It's such that wisdom has been here for hundreds of years, thousands of years. And it says something about the system that we're in, the UN in particular, that voice, that perspective is now being welcomed. And she shared, it may have been last year. I don't know if it was, but she shared before the story of Daniel Everett, who is a linguist, and he was in the Brazilian Amazon, and had asked one of the hunter-gatherer tribes. They had just come back with a nice bounty of meat, and this is the story about really what wealth is, really, and what value is. And he asked the hunter-gatherer, "What are you going to do with that extra meat? You could store it, you could maybe sell it." And he said, "What do you mean extra meat?" And he proceeded to invite the entire tribe to partake in this meal. And then he answered Daniel by saying, "I store my meat in the belly of my brother."
Mm.
So that, it's just a very different understanding of what value creation is. And there's so many stories like that. The story of Indian tribal communities, when asked by Western anthropologists why they were poor, why they had poverty, and they had no word for poverty in this language. And after a lot of kind of haggling and translation, the word they came up with, the tribal people in India, was orphan. Because to be poor is to not have community, is to not have family. So I think this regenerative movement it's an opportunity to fundamentally rethink questions of wealth, of power, of value. That's what it really means to me.
Yeah, and learn from those that are living very much connected to themselves and the nature that we all are, where we're not separate from. This kind of relationship building, community building, reconnecting with nature, and a regenerative mindset. How does that relate to your expertise around adaptive leadership? Can you tell us a little bit more
Right.
about that?
Yeah. So adaptive leadership, just quick background. You mentioned it's a framework, it's a set of tools and techniques. It's a language really for understanding how to lead, how to mobilize people in conditions of uncertainty or in conditions
Mhm.
of conflict or transition. So when you're going through a lot of change, it came out of the Kennedy School up at Harvard about 40 years ago. Very practical tool set. For me, this question of regeneration was born of honestly systems thinking. I was an engineer by training, electrical engineer, and was fascinated by systems and also frankly disappointed in places like the United Nations or my own organization. It was called the Synergos Institute. We used to host something called, what was it called? University for a Night at the UN. It probably is happening this year. I haven't been involved in many years. This is Peggy Delaney and the Synergos Institute. Great work. And even seeing how this kind of Rockefeller affiliated organization with that kind of convening power and financial, wherewithal had a hard time beyond just convening people to
Mm,
actually helping them go back to their communities, back to their agencies, back to their ministries, back to their corporations, and affecting real change,
mm.
right? And so that's kind of how I got interested in systems from a human perspective, not just technical, but human perspective. And kind of to answer your question, then, what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be human? And you talk in my industry, people talk about human capital. In fact, my younger daughter, she's a junior studying AP macroeconomics, and she's studying all about human capital. I mean, to me, what a obscene concept, human capital. So what does it mean to be human if we're not just capital? And I think this regenerative worldview, and as you mentioned, many communities and indigenous kind of worldviews that intertwine with it, invite us to think about what it means to be human as a relationship, right? Not as individuals having relationships, but to be human is to be relationship itself, which is encapsulated in many different philosophies, Ubuntu, many others. Thich Nhat Hanh in Vietnam talked about it as interbeing. So I think that's for me the fascination. And what does it mean to be human? We can't really begin to answer that question unless we're connected to soil, to health, to ourselves, like you were saying a moment ago, and to each other. So I think that's where this connection between human systems, leadership, and regeneration becomes really interesting.
And the word adaptive, what does that mean in this context?
Yeah,
Adapting to the situations, to the system, to what?
I wish I could rebrand it.
Okay.
The way to think about adaptive is kind of a biologic metaphor. So you think
Mhm.
about your DNA as a person or even as a team. Organizations, teams are living organisms, and we have
Mm,
our own DNA, which is kind of our norms, our culture, how we operate. And so adaptive is the idea that as you move through change, move through transition, move through conflict, which often is born of people's inability to adapt to change. What you are at some level doing is making a really critical discernment between what is core to my DNA, who I am as a person, who we are as a team, who we are as a United Nations, right? That we don't
mm,
want to lose as we move forward. Our values, even very technical things like policies, procedures, etc. And the good news, I think, is when you're going through change, about 95% of things don't change in a change process.
mm,
So even the shift in the UN to a regenerative agency, right? Most things probably won't change. That's good news. Change is largely conservative. So the interesting question is, what is the 5% that is going to change? And am I ready? What does it take to actually let go of that part of myself or how we've operated that we thought was core? And maybe it was. Maybe it served a purpose for many years. but then the world changed. And so adaptation is that discernment between what is essential and what is expendable. And then how do you lead people through a process where they're letting go of these things that, for some people might be everything and for others maybe a small part. But as we know, people really struggle with change. And what's interesting too, Silka, is people don't really resist change. You know, you, most people have heard that people resist change. What they're resisting is loss. So
Mm.
a lot of leadership work, and even you think about regeneration again, leaving the soil fallow for a while. There's a whole process there by which different kind of species, microorganisms thrive and others don't. But if we can hold the whole, then when we get to the other side, right, we have all that capability with us. So it's a really a
Mm.
loss and change process. And again, very, I think, intimately connected to how we think about soil health.
I met you through a program called Transformational Leadership at the UN indirectly because a long, long time ago when I started in New York with UNDP, I had a manager that took this leadership class, and I think it was spread over 6 months or so. He was regularly going, and I could tangibly feel the difference in the way he was leading us. There was more gratitude, appreciation, more trust, more support, less insecurities. So I am intrigued. How did you, who were all involved in this program, how did you pull that off? What are you teaching in these classes that help people to go through this process through this change themselves and then be able to become better managers and hold a team better in an environment that's arguably undergoing a lot of change all the time and has to adapt really fast? What was that program about?
Yeah, I remember it very well. So I think there's probably two key practices that we would explore. These are very concrete things, but then the
Mm.
change that happens in the individual is a whole different process. But the two key
Mm.
practices, the first one is to help leaders or people who aspire to be leaders differentiate between really two different kinds of problems. And I'm sure this shows up in the United Nations every day. There's what we call technical problems. So like a broken arm, for example. I mean, that's a very it's important to solve it. And luckily there are experts who know how to do that, right? And then you have adaptive problems, which are very different. And adaptive problems are ones where maybe the solution is not known, right? Or maybe the problem is not even clear. So, just to use the health example that I gave a moment ago, if you want to lose weight, there's some technical things you could do. You can go on a diet, get a gym membership. And as we all know, most times that does
Mm.
not work. In fact, the biggest waste of resources and biggest waste of time is putting technical fixes on adaptive problems. So the
Mm.
adaptive problem of losing weight involves a lot of things, right? It's how you shop, who shops, what you buy, learning how to cook. It's how you value time, right? It's a lot of other things that all need to be addressed as a system so
Mm.
that the meal plan or the diet or the gym plan can actually have a chance of taking hold. So you do both of these things. And about 35% of the problems or challenges people face are adaptive. So with this particular individual you're talking about and others in the program, it's really asking them, what is your work? And in the United Nations, like most organizations, people are very, very technical. Policies, rules, procedures, it's a lot of protocol routine, which is
Mm.
there for a reason. But you get lost in that. You lose your voice. You lose your sense of the whole. You lose yourself sometimes.
Mm.
So step one is to really make that differentiation. What is our adaptive work? What is our technical, right? Be very clear about that.
Mm.
And then the second thing is where it gets very interesting to me is, okay, to do adaptive work, even for example, to create a more regenerative, there's some technical things you could do, but a lot of that is a learning process. It's experimentation, it's failure, it's helping people even see the problem and the opportunity first. Because they don't see it, they're not going to work on it. So that requires a different kind of leadership than just being a technical expert, an SME, or somebody who has a lot of power and authority, which was often gained by being a technical expert. So these leadership opportunities, I talk about them as leadership moments. You have about 5 every single day are opportunities to reframe the work and often require courage, stepping into the unknown, asking an uncomfortable question, these kind of things. So for many people, it's a big aha to say, oh, wow, I've been doing technical work and coming at it with an authority mindset. control, bureaucracy, right? And what I really need to do is have more adaptive kind of leadership. And so when that notion of leadership fundamentally shifts in who you are, and what leadership is, what often happens is you look at the people around you, and maybe you were one of them, Silka, and you say, wow, that person's actually trying to lead. You see that more fully, and now you could support and join people in that rather than resist it, which is often what happens. So I don't know what happened in that particular case, but that's often what happens. You see the possibility in the people around you in a very different way.
That explains it really well, what this program is about. And I wonder personally, how much do we need to change the mindset of these leaders to, in my view, become more humble, better listeners, and maybe also more compassionate and kinder towards their staff? How can we change that organizational wide? What kind of concepts would you suggest, or approaches or programs to help people see the need for this kind of adaptive leadership in the UN?
Well, the good news is, by the way, it's happening already. So I'm working with the
Mhm.
FAO right now, and they're incorporating some of these practices. They're not calling it adaptive leadership, but it is very much a systems thinking kind of approach. So it is happening in pockets throughout the UN. Many folks are actually doing it. I think what it comes down to is things like compassion, empathy, humility. Well, first of all, humility. The word humility has the same root as a word for humiliation, which is
Yeah.
hummus, which is human, which is soil, actually. So, one way to think about humility is that it's born of humiliation, the humiliation of having tried to do something and failed, and there's many examples of projects and, that we've all been involved in that have failed. So it's the idea of learning, learning through failure. It's a basic same idea, but to really take those moments where you feel like, man, wow, we really messed up, as an opportunity to practice humility. So that's one example. But I do think beyond that, when you start to think systemically, when you start to actually see the whole in the way that you have to if you're a farmer, right? If you're looking at the soil and you're looking at weather, you're looking at your relationship, you're looking at the relationship between microorganisms, you begin to understand that who we are, is more than just a small sense of self, where who I am ends with my skin. And there you are, here I am.
Mhm.
Who you are, it begins to include other people or even nature, you know? You talked about more than human beings, I think is the language you used when you did your introduction.
Mhm.
It's a very powerful language, right? It acknowledges the beingness of other things, other beings. And so when my sense of who I am expands to include more, right? This happens when you get married or have a child too. Your heart just kind of expands, your capacity for love expands. So when who you are is bigger than just this, then things like selfishness are actually not so bad. You don't have to fight against it if your sense of self is bigger than who you are. And so things like compassion and empathy, right? They come naturally, not as a forced effort. Oh, now I need to do this. Now I need to be this. Now I'm not good enough. I need to change, right? And in some ways, when you think about leadership development or personal development, a lot of it is actually, I would call it, it's kind of a form of self aggression. I'm not good enough. I need to be better. And again, that's good. It's good to aspire and grow. But if it's coming from a place of lack, right? It's kind of the same old thing. There's not enough, right? So I think it's a natural growth process once you begin to understand your connectedness to the system or to soil or to others. So, it's I'm not trying to avoid the question, but it doesn't have a technical answer, right? It's much more an expansion of your sense of self, which might be another way to talk about love, frankly, but that's a whole different podcast.
Yeah, and I think it's a lot about just the awareness that you want to be the best leader possible in your life and your team, and develop your own potential, but also that of those around you. And then you start questioning, how can I show the way myself? Like, how can I be the change I want to see in the world? And then hopefully get the tools through the organization and through people like you who offer these kind of trainings. If I may ask you, for young leaders in the UN, maybe just starting managing the first time staff, do you have any advice to them, what specific tools or methods they could apply to lead in the way that you have? already elaborated on.
Yeah, I guess another way to kind of say what I was saying in in a more technical sense. In adaptive leadership, we talk about thinking politically, and some people hate politics. You know, it sounds like it's just people trying to kind of squeeze their way through things that maybe they wouldn't get through otherwise, and playing the game. And it is that too. But another way to think about politics is that what happens when human beings come together with different needs, different value systems, different loyalties. And so I think for young leaders, understanding not the politics per se, but for every person you talk to, there's five people behind them who
Mm,
are demanding their time, demanding their attention, who want them to avoid loss. You know, again, if a lot of leadership and change is about loss. So rather than just being another person trying to force them to do something, is to spend the time understanding them, yes, as human beings, but also how they're embedded in this bureaucracy, in this system.
mm,
And once you begin to see that, a system begins to emerge and you can understand and then begin to develop strategies for dealing with resistance. So I think that's at a very kind of practical level, do a kind of a
mhm,
political faction mapping, we call it. And there's some tools and techniques and things for doing that, looking at people's values, their loyalties, their losses at risk. And the other thing I think is just to very practically don't wait, because most people who wait until they have, until they're called a leader have now become the system. You know, they've internalized all those aspects of the system that they themselves were trying to change. And so
mm,
don't trust your naivety.
mm,
That naiveness that is a real resource, because the chances are what you're seeing is true, but it's not seen by those who've been acculturated by the system. So just start now and know that you're going to get resistance. You cannot lead adaptive change without getting resistance. It's impossible. So, you know,
mm,
what is your relationship to conflict, to not being liked? That never feels good, right? But if you're connected to a sense of purpose and really believe in who you are, that resistance when it comes will be something you know how to engage with, you know, and maybe you don't do it today, you know, if you're in a place where you need more emotional resilience, but just to know that leadership in this way doesn't come with pats on the back. Maybe 5 years down the road it will. It's about staying connected to your sense of purpose. And again, I think we're surrounded by many people, Silka, at the UN who are doing this every single day.
I just wanted to say what you're describing. I have seen these managers around me, these colleagues, sometimes also maybe interns that had these qualities in them, leadership qualities that you have mentioned. And I've seen how the system then functions better, or people just get drawn to it. They feel inspired. And as you said, this reconnection to our purpose is so important. And I feel in the UN, we just take it for granted that we have a purpose. And in the end, I think we all need to be reminded every day of why we're doing what we're doing. And that way you can really connect people to their drive, to their passion, to trying to give their all and do it in a joyful way because they feel like they're contributing to something larger. So I think just for that, it is so important to have these kind of leadership trainings. Imagine all the UN would be trained in adaptive, regenerative, other kinds of system thinking leadership modules. What could be the potential? How could the new UN look like in your view?
Yeah. It brings us back to your question about regeneration. You know, in a regenerative ecosystem like soil, every organism, every, you know, individual is brings something unique and important and needed to that system, right? Every individual has a contribution, a gift, you might even say, a talent. And
Mm,
so I think in a truly regenerative organization, you are, if you don't know what your gift is, you know, you are supported in finding that out.
mm,
Robert Wall Kimmerer again talks a lot about rites of passage and initiation, how young children, young adults discover what their contribution is to the community and then are welcomed back into the community, oftentimes after
mm,
going away for, you know, weeks or months. And so I think that's part of it. And if you know what your gift is, if you know what you're here to bring, you are supported in doing so. And so it's a very
mm,
expressive, creative environment. It's not utopia because people's talents and gifts and needs will still conflict, right? And that's what makes it exciting. But when you do that well, when you can negotiate these competing priorities, competing needs and values, now you can really build the skill set of democracy. I don't mean big D democracy. but it's the when you're
Mm.
dealing with pluralism and holding conflict in a creative way, holding conflict in a life affirming way. And so, you look at the rise of authoritarianism. Like you mentioned my book, Your Leadership Moment. It's your leadership moment in an age of authoritarianism.
Mm.
And a lot of that is about reclaiming our agency. It's and part of that is to first of all stop looking to these people who we call leaders who are not actually leading for things that they can't provide. They can provide certain things, but most of the adaptive challenges we face in the UN and elsewhere cannot be solved by leaders. And so
Mm.
we begin to understand how to hold that kind of creative tension amongst ourselves. And that slowly whittles away the power of authoritarianism and restores agency to where it's needed for true creativity and growth. So I think, not to be too idealistic about it, but this is possible in pockets. And as you were saying a moment ago, when people have a taste of that, when they see that happening, they feel inspired. They
Mm.
say, yeah, that's what I thought there should be. That's who we are at our best. And then they find that energy and purpose to really go through some of the harder moments too, including the personal change piece.
Yeah, I love that. And I always felt that because of the high demands on the UN, the time pressure, the budget crisis, that kind of leadership development or even leadership moments within your teams are suppressed because of the urgency of life and work. And we're all overwhelmed with the amount of work we have. But I think you just made it very clear why it's so important to still do it, because once you have created this container for creativity to emerge, for the special gift that all of us have to be shown and appreciated, we can move mountains. And then, in my view, this will then also inspire not just your team around you, but also all the communities you work with in your missions. And it might have like a much bigger ripple effect than just within the UN. And that's why I'm so grateful we can have this conversation, because I'm sure a lot of our listeners also are very interested in that. What I ask all of my podcast guests is, imagine you are the next Secretary General who is going to start on the 1st of January in 2027. What would be your first order of business? What would be your agenda? What kind of 3 to 5 initial things would you implement in the UN?
Hmm. I think the first one is to reward truth. There's a lot of
Mm.
self censorship that happens for good reasons, job security,
Mm.
fear, etc., political repercussions. So you can't go all the way there, but the more you reward truth and the more you're dealing with reality, the better chance you have of making this kind of vision you talked about possible. And
Mm.
because, most of us, I think, myself included, we live in kind of a partial reality, just the part that's easy to talk about or easy to do. It's hard to kind of embrace these polarities, and all the conflicts that are happening in the world right now. It's easy to take one side or the other. So, and which is a form of insanity, by the way. If you're only living in partial reality, yeah,
Mm.
form of insanity. So let's reward truth. Let's reward risk taking, and also I think and these are just kind of these are very ethereal. They're not very practical. I think the idea that as we all know, the people closest to the problems and opportunities are often closest to the solutions. And that's because the solutions often involve them. They're not technical solutions alone, it's the adaptive work. And so, really trusting these voices from below, these voices from the outside, even, and letting go of this notion that we have to control things. Yeah, policies, procedures, all these things that form bureaucracy, they have a reason. I mean, at its best, the UN, like many bureaucracies, bureaucracy serves the purpose of fairness at its best. If you're taking kind of the human decision making process out of it, it's about fairness and access. But at its worst, it becomes something else. And so I think, let's try to restore the sense of agency to the individual and trust people to make the best choices
Mm.
for themselves, for their work, for their team, for their community, because bureaucracy also is a form of institutionalized distrust. No one intends it that way, but you're always
Mm.
mitigating against mistakes, mitigating against people going out on their own. And so I think that's a big, I think it's a fundamental shift, and whether the UN can make that shift or not, I think is a big open question. But again, there's a lot of people in the UN who are already operating this way. So I'd find those people and just really lift them up and bring them together, because these living models, an appreciative inquiry type approach, is really the best thing you can do beyond, beyond any training, beyond any kind of framework, etc. It's really looking at the living people who you already know, who are already doing this work with the scars on their back to prove it,
Mhm.
and lifting them up. That's going to inspire more than anything.
Can I just quickly follow up? What do you mean with appreciative inquiry? I haven't really heard about
Oh,
this.
there's a this is for my I did my master's in organizational change, and so there's a whole bunch
Mm,
of techniques and processes out there. One that's called appreciative inquiry, and the basic idea is that you find where it's working already,
mm,
and you highlight that, you showcase that, you support
mm,
that, and this can be used both within organizations, but we actually used it at once in addressing child malnutrition in Maharashtra,
mm.
a major project, systems change project. It was around nursing young children and trying to find best practices that were already within the community and highlighting those. It's probably something that's already being done by folks on the ground, but it's taking that
Mm.
approach to thinking about how do you lead organizational change and not just train or structure or reorganize your way into it. It's a more of a bottom up kind of approach.
Yeah, I love also transformative spaces in the UN that is trying to bring together all these examples and try to support and promote this kind of approach to leadership. And I've personally done some research on what's already happening, and good to hear about your example for FAO as well. That truly gives hope that together we'll all support the transformation of the UN towards a life affirming system. I feel like you're embodying this kind of leadership already so well in yourself, and that you are speaking from your truth and courageously and humble. Do you have any personal tool or practice that you can share with listeners to maybe get to your level of groundedness and calmness and leadership?
Maybe two. I mean, there's probably some others. I think first of all, I have a daily contemplative practice. For some
Mm,
people that might be yoga or meditation or prayer. So I have my space where I can just be, and
mm,
not do. And so that's something I really, really cherish. I've been doing that for over 30 years.
mm,
I used to live in Japan. I was actually working with the FAO, actually with FAO and ITTO and a number of others in Yokohama, Japan. I was introduced in Japan to these kind of practices. And then the second thing is it's very simple, but I love the question, what is it like to be you?
mm,
And so, when you come across someone who really rubs you the wrong way, or even someone who you feel some animosity toward, or who's done things to you, and this is not something you
mm.
can do all the time, but those people, what is it like to be you? Really? I don't mean in a kind of, a cynical sense, but what does it really mean if I had all of your lived experiences, was raised how you were raised, educated how you were educated, had traumas that you've had that we've all had, I'd probably be just like you. And so that's the question. Again,
Mhm.
this is that expanded sense of self that I was talking about. So it really stretches the heart. It stretches the imagination sometimes. And it can really make the people around you angry when you start to empathize. You're not saying it's okay to do what they're doing, right? But
No,
you're saying, I understand you. And that to me is just one of the most mind and heart expanding things you can do. So I practice that, whenever I can.
beautiful. Like generate more empathy and put yourself into other people's shoes. I feel as one of the solutions how we can gap now all these huge divides and mindsets and opinions that we experience in the world, just to remember that everybody comes with their own lived experience that has made them into who they are. And that at the end, we're all human beings that are just trying to wing it here on planet Earth while we can. And maybe assume that everybody has somewhere good intentions also in your environment. So beautiful. Thank you for reminding all of us and sharing all your wisdom. If people would like to reach out to you, get in touch with you, work with you, what can they do? Where can they get started? Where can they find your books that you've written?
I'm in all the usual places: Amazon, Your Leadership
Mm.
Moment, the organization you mentioned, Adaptive Change Advisors, and yeah, the YouTube videos are a little bit younger version of me. So it's been a while, but yeah, all the usual places. But and we have a
Great.
great team around the world too. So it's yeah, I'd be happy to talk.
We'll put it into the show notes for our listeners. So thank you for sharing and for being here and all your wisdom. And I wish you all the best on your adaptive leadership journey.
Thank you so much, Silke.
Bye.